June 8th, 793 AD, dawn broke over the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. The monks of the monastery were beginning their morning prayers when dragon-prowed ships appeared on the horizon. The Vikings had arrived. What followed is etched in historical memory as an act of pure barbarism. The raiders stormed the monastery, killed monks who resisted, enslaved others, and looted the treasures. Gold chalices, jeweled gospel covers, silver candlesticks, everything of value was thrown into the longships. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. This moment is taught as the beginning of the Viking Age, 3 centuries of raids, invasions, and terror across Europe. The narrative is simple: barbaric Norsemen attacking civilized Christian kingdoms for plunder and glory. But this narrative is fundamentally wrong. The Vikings were not mindless raiders. They were sophisticated traders executing a calculated economic strategy, and the treasure they took from Lindisfarne was not the goal. It was the starting capital for something far more ambitious. The Vikings were building Europe's first international currency network, and the foundation of that network was silver. To understand what the Vikings accomplished, you must first understand the monetary crisis facing medieval Europe in the 8th century. The Roman Empire had operated a sophisticated currency system for 700 years. Gold and silver coins circulated from Britain to Egypt. Trade flourished because everyone trusted Roman coinage. But when Rome collapsed in the 5th century, so did its monetary system. By 700 AD, Europe had fragmented into dozens of small kingdoms. Each realm minted its own coins with different weights and purities. There was no standardization, no trust. Worse, Europe had very limited silver sources. The Spanish mines that had supplied Rome were depleted or inaccessible due to Muslim control of Iberia. The German mines had not yet been discovered. European kingdoms were running out of silver to mint coins. This created a severe currency shortage. Without reliable coinage, long-distance trade collapsed. Local lords reverted to barter. The economy contracted. European merchants desperately needed silver, but they had no access to it. The Vikings, sailing from Scandinavia, discovered the solution. The Islamic world was drowning in silver. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, controlled vast silver mines in Central Asia, particularly in present-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. These mines produced enormous quantities of high-quality silver. The Caliphate minted millions of dirhams, standardized silver coins weighing approximately 297 grams. Arab merchants used these dirhams to trade across an empire that stretched from Spain to India. But the Islamic world had more silver than it needed. There was excess capacity. Prices were low. The Vikings realized something crucial. There was an arbitrage opportunity. Silver was cheap in the Islamic world and desperately needed in Europe. Anyone who could transport silver from Baghdad to London could make extraordinary profits. But there was a problem. The overland route from Baghdad to Europe passed through the Byzantine Empire and various hostile territories. The Byzantines controlled Mediterranean trade and charged heavy tariffs. Viking ships could not sail through the Mediterranean without being intercepted. So the Vikings found another route, the Volga River. Starting around 800 AD, Viking traders began sailing up the Volga River from the Baltic Sea deep into the Russian interior. They established trading posts at Novgorod, Smolensk, and eventually Kiev. From Kiev, they could reach the Caspian Sea and connect with Arab merchants traveling from Baghdad. This was not a simple journey. The Volga route required portaging boats overland between river systems. It meant negotiating with Slavic tribes, Khazar kingdoms, and eventually Arab middlemen. It took months, sometimes years, to complete a round trip, but the profits were staggering. A Viking trader who could transport 100 pounds of silver from the Caspian to Scandinavia could multiply his investment tenfold when selling into European markets. Archaeological evidence confirms this trade on a massive scale. Over 80,000 Arab dirhams have been found in Scandinavian hoards, most dating from the 9th and 10th centuries. The vast majority were minted in Baghdad, Samarkand, and other Central Asian cities. But the Vikings did not just transport silver. They transformed it. Arab dirhams were high-quality silver coins, but they were Islamic. They bore Arabic inscriptions and Quranic verses. Christian European kingdoms were reluctant to use overtly Muslim currency, so the Vikings built mints in York, England, in Dublin, Ireland, in Kiev, in what is now Ukraine. These mints took Arab dirhams, melted them down, and recast them into new standardized coins acceptable to Christian merchants. This was not just currency exchange. This was the creation of financial infrastructure. The York Mint, established around 920 AD under Viking control, became one of the most productive mints in Europe. It produced thousands of standardized silver pennies per month. These coins became the trusted medium of exchange across northern Europe. Dublin, under Viking rule from 841 AD, developed into a major commercial hub. Its mint supplied currency to Ireland, Scotland, and Western England. Viking Dublin was not a raiding base. It was a financial center. In Kiev, the origin point of what would become Russia, was founded as a Viking trading post. The word Rus itself likely derives from the Old Norse word for rowers. Kiev's wealth came not from agriculture or conquest, but from its position as the critical transshipment point on the Volga silver route. The Vikings had done something unprecedented. They had created an international monetary network connecting the Islamic world, Scandinavia, and Christian Europe. They controlled the supply of silver, the most critical commodity in the medieval economy, and with that control came power. Here is the part that historians often miss. The Viking raids were not separate from the silver trade. They were part of the same economic strategy. When Vikings raided monasteries like Lindisfarne, they were not just stealing treasure. They were eliminating alternative sources of wealth that could compete with their monetary system. Monasteries hoarded gold and silver. By raiding them, Vikings were both acquiring initial capital and ensuring that precious metals flowed through their controlled mints rather than being locked away in church vaults. When Vikings invaded England and established the Danelaw, a region under Norse control, they were not just conquering territory, they were securing markets for their currency. English lords in the Danelaw were required to pay taxes in Viking minted coins. This created demand for Viking currency, which Vikings were happy to supply at profitable rates. When Vikings extorted Danegeld, massive tribute payments from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to prevent raids, they insisted on payment in silver. This further drained European silver reserves, while enriching Viking traders who could replenish the supply from their Volga routes. The entire system was a closed loop designed to maximize Viking control over European monetary supply, and it worked spectacularly. By 950 AD, Viking minted coins were circulating from Iceland to Russia. European lords, whether they liked Vikings or not, depended on Viking currency for commerce. The silver trade had made Scandinavia wealthy and politically powerful. But the system had a fatal flaw. It depended entirely on continuous supply of Central Asian silver. And in the early 11th century, the silver began running out. The mines in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan were not infinite. By 1020 AD, production was declining. The Volga route became more dangerous as the Khazar kingdom collapsed and new political powers disrupted trade. Arab merchants found alternative routes that bypassed Viking middlemen. The flow of silver into Scandinavia slowed. Then it stopped. This had immediate economic consequences. Viking mints could not produce coins without raw silver. Currency supply contracted. Trade networks that depended on Viking silver faced liquidity crises. The wealth that had funded 3 centuries of expansion evaporated. And the Vikings, desperate to maintain their monetary empire, made a catastrophic gamble. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway and one of the wealthiest Vikings of his era, invaded England with a massive fleet. His goal was to conquer England and gain control of its economy, including whatever silver reserves remained. But Harald Hardrada had a problem. Without silver to pay his soldiers, he could not maintain a large professional army. He had to promise his troops a share of plunder, which meant they were mercenaries, not loyal soldiers. On September 25, 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Hardrada's army faced the English forces of King Harold Godwinson. The battle was brutal. Hardrada was killed. His army was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Viking invasion force to England, only 24 returned to Norway. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror invaded southern England and defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. England fell to the Normans, themselves descended from Vikings but long integrated into French feudal structures. The Viking Age ended not with a gradual decline, but with sudden military collapse. And the root cause was not military inferiority. It was economic. The silver monopoly had broken. Without the financial advantage, Viking military power evaporated. This is the critical lesson that most historians overlook. The Vikings did not conquer Europe with superior weapons or tactics. They conquered it with superior financial infrastructure. They created a monetary system that made European lords dependent on Viking-controlled silver supply. When that silver supply disappeared, so did Viking power. Now let me show you why this matters today. The Viking silver monopoly lasted approximately 270 years, from 793 to 1066. It was based on controlling access to a critical commodity that everyone needed but few could obtain. As long as Vikings controlled the supply, they could extract wealth from the entire European economy. When the commodity source depleted, the empire collapsed within a generation. Does this sound familiar? In 1974, the United States established the petrodollar system. After Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold in 1971, the U.S. needed a new way to maintain dollar dominance. The solution was oil. The U.S. negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations. Oil would be priced and sold exclusively in U.S. dollars. Any country that wanted to buy oil, which every industrial economy needed, had to first acquire dollars. This created artificial demand for dollars. It allowed the U.S. to run massive trade deficits without consequence, because foreign nations needed dollars to buy oil. It It gave the U.S. control over global energy commerce. The petrodollar system has lasted 51 years so far, but it is showing the same structural weakness as the Viking silver monopoly. Oil production is not infinite. More importantly, the monopoly on dollar-denominated oil sales is breaking. Russia is selling oil to China in yuan. Saudi Arabia is negotiating non-dollar oil sales with multiple countries. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems specifically to bypass dollar requirements. Just as the Volga silver route became unreliable in the 11th century, the petrodollar enforcement mechanism is becoming unreliable in the 21st century. And just as Vikings responded to declining silver access with desperate military expansion, the U.S. response to declining petrodollar dominance has been military intervention in oil-producing regions. Iraq, Libya, Syria, all oil-rich nations that attempted to sell oil in non-dollar currencies before being destabilized. The pattern is identical. Control of a critical commodity creates monetary monopoly. Monetary monopoly creates economic dominance. Loss of commodity access destroys the entire system. The Vikings could not adapt when silver dried up, because their entire economy was structured around that single resource flow. They had no alternative foundation. The United States similarly structured its post-1971 economy around petrodollar recycling. If that system breaks, the consequences will be as sudden and as catastrophic as Stamford Bridge was for the Vikings. Harold Hardrada invaded England in 1066 with 300 ships because he had no other option. The silver was gone. The monetary system was collapsing. Military conquest of a silver-holding territory was the only strategy left. He lost, and the Viking Age ended. The parallel is not perfect. The United States in 2025 is not Norway in 1066, but the structural economic pressures are remarkably similar. Resource monopoly decline, currency system stress, desperate attempts to maintain dominance through force rather than financial infrastructure. The Vikings teach us that empires built on commodity monopolies are inherently fragile. They can dominate for centuries, they can seem invincible, but when the underlying resource flow stops, collapse is swift. From 793 to 1066, Vikings ruled Northern Europe, not because they were better warriors, but because they were better bankers. They understood monetary systems. They built infrastructure to control silver supply. They created currency networks that made them indispensable. And then the silver ran out, and within one generation the entire structure disappeared. The Viking longships are gone. The mints of York and Dublin are archaeological sites. The Volga trade route is a historical footnote. But the lesson remains. Control the resource that backs the currency, and you control the economy. Lose that resource, and everything else collapses. In 793, that resource was silver. In 2025, it is oil and the dollar system built around it. The Vikings could not maintain their empire when the mines of Central Asia depleted. The United States cannot maintain petrodollar hegemony if oil trade moves to alternative currencies. The weapon is not missiles or aircraft carriers. The weapon is monetary infrastructure. And when that infrastructure loses its foundation, no amount of military force can compensate. The Vikings proved this at Stamford Bridge. 24 ships returned from 300, a 92% loss rate, the end of an era. Not because they forgot how to fight, but because they ran out of silver. And you cannot pay an army with empty promises.